and a little scene set up for this. So, and Maya has crashed. Perfect. So sketchy. All right. While I reopen Maya, if you look in the images folder of the little MASH thing, if anyone's following along with that, I have these weird little images made up. So, all right. So here is basically 3 versions of the same room. This is the environmental fog file. So this is the lighting without any kind of environmental fog. This is one type of environmental fog that is not affected by light. And this is another type of fog that is affected by light. So I'm going to show you guys how to set these up. The ones that are affected by light, you can do weird stuff like God rays with them. So as an example, I have this like weird pier scene that I think I looked at the render from earlier. So this is the same scene. This is basically one super, super tiny area light. And no environmental fog, and then this is the same scene with environmental fog. I set the fog to be kind of bluish color, and you can see that you have some interesting little like rays and shadows coming beneath the pier, especially where the light is sort of shining through and like shadowing certain areas and like really like shining a lot on some of the fog. And then also as you get back towards the further, or if you get farther away, kind of under the pier ends up with a lot more shadowing than it had. Actually, it kind of ends up a little bit lighter, but it has like a very sort of environmental like feeling like you're going back in space effect. So I'm going to show you guys how to set both of these up. It's actually fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to start with the, no, I have to set my project again. I'm going to start with the environmental fog file. The pier one behaves really, really awfully with the first type of fog I'm going to show you. So great. All right. So again, starting with the environmental fog, and it's just back to this like sketchy little room that I've made. And I think I've started with fog turned on in this space. No, I didn't. Okay. So again, here's the light pretty much, or like the scene without any kind of fog in it. Basically all it is again just like a cube, and I have a ginormous area light stretched and kind of angled showing through the window. I'm not entirely sure why I've set it up like that, I just sort of did. But this is, again, what you get without fog. The first type of fog that we're going to add is the one that's not affected by light. To add both of them, you still have to go into your render settings. It's like the same spot, you just hook up a different thing, basically. Go into your render settings, into the Arnold tab, and go down to this little environment drop down here. When you click on that, you will see 2 different things. So we're going to be working with the atmosphere tab. This is an example of when I said there's some like stuff from older versions of Maya that they're phasing out. This is basically just like essentially adding I don't even know. It's a cheap, hacky way to get a background in your object. Pretty much the equivalent of adding a sphere with a surface shader on it. Again, they're getting rid of it, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time working about it or learning on it. And this is just an example of if you ever see this legacy thing in like a version or 2 of Maya, this will be gone. It's just kind of like their heads up for like, hey, we're getting rid of this. Anywho, to actually put in the fog, you just go into the atmosphere, into this little checker box for it, and I'm just going to do create AI fog. So these are the ones that I was messing with previously. Start with a fresh one. So just create AI fog. This is, again, the one that is not affected by lighting at all. So I'm going to play this. And you can see that this is, by default, what it starts out with. If you ever need to access your fog settings, you can just go back into your render settings and just sort of click on this little through box, and it should pull it up in your attribute editor. So you can change the color of your fog if you want. Oh god, that's awful. Alright, I'm feeling kind of like toxic fog today. It feels like a good idea for some reason. You can mess with the distance a little bit. I find this easier on like scenes that are set up in like real world units, which this is like super tiny, so it's kind of annoying to work with. You can play with the height, bunch of different stuff. So basically, most of the ones that I focus on primarily, like when I first put this in, is like, what direction do I want this to be coming from? So right now this is like pretty much, if you're farther away, the fog looks kind of thicker the farther you get from the camera, which would be good for something like an underwater scene where, you know, you do rapidly lose visibility the more water you're looking through. If you wanted something maybe like a dense fog on the ground, like for, you know, a misty swamp or something like that, you'd want to change the position of that. So basically that's these little boxes here. So this is your ground normal, and this is, I interpret that as like basically which direction is this facing. So right now it's facing from the z-axis, and if you look down in this little thing here, that's the z-axis is pretty much what I'm looking straight down to take this render. So if I set that to 0, I then have no fog because it's like you have no, there's like 0, 0, 0, the fog has nowhere to be, there is no fog. In this case, I'm going to see what happens when I set the y to be 1, so this is x, y, z. And you can see that now the fog is coming from the floor. This is the point where you can usually go in and, again, you can kind of play with the height of the fog if you want to. You can play with the distance of the fog. In this particular scene, it does become a little bit hard to deal with, but so distance is basically how far away does the densest fog go from the ground normal, or like from the starting position on the ground. So this is, ground normal is telling you basically which axis the direction of the fog is coming from. Ground point says what's the starting point for this. So if I set this to, I set this back to 0.02. If I set this to something like 30, it's gonna, you can kind of see, and it's really ugly, but basically it's starting the fog up way higher in the scene. If I set this to something like -40, it effectively looks like there's no fog. You can kind of actually see it through the window. But basically it's starting the fog before that ground plane exists. You see it's still there. In this case, I have my ground is actually on 0, 0, 0. So leaving that as 0 does actually make sense. And again, I clicked out of my fog, so I'm just going to go back into my render settings to access the settings for that again. So I'll set this to 0. And again, you can see it does kind of make like a weird sort of foggy effect. And you get a lot of like very strange sort of looks for this. One thing that you can do if you're so inclined is you can actually map in, this is going to get really weird. I'm going to map in like a noise texture to distance. And you could do this with like a volume noise or just like a regular noise texture, but you can kind of see maybe a little bit that kind of has the effect, especially if you look around the base of this area, where it'll kind of like feather the height of that and give it like a little bit of like swirly interest to it. If I go in and I render just this area, I can change the time of this, and you can should make like something kind of like a weird swirling effect almost of this. Not quite. You can kind of see it like at the very end, like right here. It'll change a little bit, but so you can do kind of weird stuff like that. No, duh. All right. Back in my settings. And then again, so same way you can key ramp textures and stuff. If I wanted to, I could. What are you doing? There we go. So if I wanted to, I could key the values of this Y and Z value. So I'm just going to, on frame 1, right-click on Y and right-click on Z and do set key for both. And then I'm going to say by frame 120, I'm going to set Y to 0 and Z to 1. So this should actually change, and don't forget to like rekey these guys. But this should actually change the direction of this fog. So if I see frame 1, and you can see that the fog is slowly rotating in a very awkward fashion to sort of come back up if that is something that you for some reason need. So again, you can key all these, pretty much all of these values, and just kind of like fiddle around with things to get what you want and what you need in the scene. Are there any questions about this particular type of fog? All right. For the other type of fog, I'm just going to nip into the other scene, just because it shows the effect a little bit better. So I'm going to go into environmental fog pier, where I spelled pier incorrectly. So here's my scene, and I think, if I remember correctly, I have fog turned on. So I'll just turn that off really quick. So by default, this is what the render looks like. I have my light being super orange. This is basically just a lumpy plane that I made with a texture deformer, with a surface shader with transmission on it, so it looks kind of like water, sort of. So again, this is without any kind of fog. The other type of fog I mentioned is the atmosphere volume. So I have this one here that just sort of exists, which was a royal pain to set up because I scaled this scene horribly. So like I had to go in increments of like 0.001 for most things, and it was absolutely horrifying. In this case, I'm going to make a new atmospheric volume so I can show you guys how to set this up more or less from scratch. And what the heck? All right. So by default, it pretty much looks like nothing's happening. By default, I'm going to turn my water off, will set the density to 0. So if I set the density up higher, you can see that's actually a pretty cool effect. If you're going for like apocalyptic explosion. But you can see it does still show the god rays and stuff. But basically the density of this is, as you might expect, like how dense or aggressive the fog actually is. So I can set that to something like maybe like that. And if you change the color, you can actually kind of make this look almost like the effect of like a water. So like the deeper back you go, the sort of like darker and murkier that gets. It breaks down a little bit because I have like, it's not actually water, it's just sort of like the giant volume, pretty much just like a light over up here. There's no actual water here. But you can see that like even just by doing this, I do have some little god rays set up. And again, this would not work if I used the other fog. I might try it for grins at the end, but it usually works pretty sketchily. So I'm just going to set this up higher because it might be maybe easier to see. So anisotropy, I usually use, this is like kind of the thing that I usually end up fiddling with if I am looking to sort of accentuate or break down some of the god rays. Effectively setting it up really high tends to make the light overall brighter, and setting it to, I find in the few scenes I've done with this, the slightly lower settings are going to help to bring out and like show up some of the god rays a little bit more. But again, it's like complete settings twiddling with this. This is like a really fiddly scene in and of itself, but you can see that again there's like some nice stuff happening. Attenuation, I think, is just pretty much how much of the light that this actually cuts from the scene. So the higher I set this, you can see that basically the drop off, like this light is like kind of stupidly bright. The higher I set the attenuation, the quicker the light falls off and like gets dispersed in that fog. So if you're going for like a really dark sort of setup here with like, it totally looks like more underwatery in my opinion. So you can use attenuation to sort of control that. So again, you can see here the light is like super blown out. If I set this up higher, it gets a lot like murkier and sort of dimmer. And you can even set the colors of this to like other weird colors. I'm gonna set it to, oh god. Well, that looks delightful. So you can set the color of the attenuation to be something different if you want. This is gonna be like, I think added or something onto your existing mesh. So it can create some like pretty strange color combinations. I usually don't play with that a whole heck of a lot, but you can get some interesting effects like that. So any questions on that? All right. The only thing that I want to go over, and I'm actually really surprised because this is sampling pretty reasonably right now. See if I can go out of my way to make this grainier. All right, well that's annoying. The one time I'm actually annoyed that it's having nice samples. But basically there's 3 places you want to look for samples for this particular type of fog. So the first one is in the settings for the fog itself. And if I zoom in on this area, you can see there's like samples here. For the other scene that I did, for some reason I had to set this up to like 40 to get something kind of, that was like still kind of grainy. So if I set this to something maybe like 10, that should go through, and you can see there's like definitely a difference between, might be kind of hard to see, but there's like a difference between this area here and like how grainy this original render is. If I set this to something like 20 to be like really aggressive about it, this is like totally smoother than this one. So that's the first place for the samples, is again just in the environment fog settings itself. I'm going to set this back down to the default 5. Next place you usually are going to look is you can modify the samples in the light itself. So if I go in and find my area light, the samples you're looking for are not these samples that you'd usually use. If you scroll down a little bit more, you'll see that it has an option for volume samples. So this is what you're actually going to want to look for this. So we'll see what happens if I set this one up to 10. In this case, I don't think that one is really, that did pretty much nothing for the sampling. So in this case, volume samples of 2 is pretty much fine for this light. One thing just to point out really quickly, you can straight up just not have this light affect that fog at all. So if I turn off cast volumetric shadows, it pretty much just looks like the other type of fog. It's like you get a little bit more control over like how the light shines through it. Like you can still see that's like kind of attenuating up here, and like the light is sort of falling off. It's just not casting those little God ray sort of shadows. So by default, this is turned on in Arnold, and it totally looks nicer when it's on, in my opinion. But you can turn it off if you so choose. Other place that you can look for settings to work out your sampling is just in the render settings, in the pretty much usual tabs for Arnold render settings. Let's go back in here and look for the volume indirect samples. So you can try setting these up higher. In this case, it seems to be making a tiny bit of difference. It's like not super crazy. It's maybe like a itty bitty bit smoother, but I find that most times it's either like this one that I want to play with or the settings in the actual fog itself. And more often than not, it's kind of the ones in the fog itself. But just remember, there are 3 places you can check for the different sampling for this fog. So yeah. Any questions on that? All right. Any questions on anything else that we went over today? All right, cool. So that's pretty much it.